My name is Rachel Carter, and I'm 26 years old. This happened just last October, during what was supposed to be a relaxing camping trip with my boyfriend Connor, my sister Maddie, and her boyfriend Noah. We had taken my old RV into Sterling Forest State Park in New York, a sprawling woodland of thick trees and secluded trails. I planned this trip to reconnect with Maddie and maybe clear my head a little. It had been a tough year, losing my best friend Ashley to a car accident. I thought being out in nature might help. If I had known what we were walking into, I never would have gone. We arrived on a chilly Friday afternoon. The air smelled crisp, the leaves were a riot of reds and oranges, and the quiet felt like the escape I desperately needed. We found a secluded spot near an abandoned fire tower, miles from the nearest trailhead. Maddie and Noah were already arguing about whether Noah should bring his enormous book on folklore. Connor laughed it off, teasing Maddie about being too scared to handle ghost stories. I brushed it aside, trying to keep the mood light. "Let's get the campfire going before the sun sets," I said. "This place is perfect, and I don't want to waste a second." But from the moment we got there, things felt off. The first weird thing was the RV's water filter. It worked fine when we tested it at home, but now it sputtered and refused to clean any of the water we drew from the nearby creek. Maddie's flashlight also refused to work, and Noah's phone, fully charged that morning, was somehow down to 5%. Connor laughed it all off as bad luck, but I felt a twinge of unease. That night, after dinner, we sat around the fire, laughing and swapping stories. The stars were stunning, and for a while, I thought the trip might actually go well. That's when we first heard it, rustling in the bushes just beyond the firelight. "Probably a deer," Connor said casually, tossing another log on the fire. But then came the whispers. Faint at first, like the wind moving through the trees. Then louder, enough to make Maddie sit up and clutch Noah's arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "It's just the wind," Connor said, but I could tell even he wasn't convinced. The whispers grew, faint but distinct, like they were calling our names. I told myself it was just our imaginations, the way silence in the woods plays tricks on you. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next morning, we set out for a hike. Connor insisted we explore a trail he found on a map, one that led deeper into the forest. Maddie grumbled but followed, and Noah tagged along with his camera and that huge folklore book tucked under his arm. A few miles in, Noah froze. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a tree. Scratched into the bark were deep claw marks, too precise to be natural. They formed strange symbols that gave me goosebumps just looking at them. "Probably kids messing around," Connor said, but Noah frowned. "No, these are old," he muttered, "and they're not random. These look like—" He trailed off, shaking his head. I didn't press him, but I could tell he was spooked. Further along the trail, we spotted a deer standing in our path. It didn't move as we approached, just stared at us with wide, unblinking eyes. Something about it wasn't right. Its eyes seemed almost human. Maddie clutched my arm, whispering, "That's not normal." Connor waved his arms to shoo it away, but the deer didn't flinch. When we turned back to check on it, it was gone, just like that. That night was worse. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. This time, we could hear them coming from different directions, circling our camp. I tried to ignore it, but when I heard my own voice calling from the woods, my blood ran cold. "Help! I'm hurt!" It sounded exactly like me, but I was sitting right there. Connor shot me a look. "That's just some kind of echo," he said, his voice shaking. But Noah looked pale as a sheet. He whispered something to Maddie, and she gasped. "What is it?" I demanded. Noah hesitated. There's this legend," he said, "about skinwalkers. They're shapeshifters. They mimic voices to lure people into the woods." Connor groaned. "You've got to be kidding me." But I couldn't shake the fear creeping up my spine. I had heard my voice out there. There was no denying it. By the third day, the tension was unbearable. None of us had slept much, and we decided to hike out early. But no matter which trail we took, we kept looping back to our campsite. The forest seemed to shift and stretch, leading us in circles. Connor, who'd always been the steady one, snapped at Noah for filling everyone's heads with nonsense. Maddie cried quietly, clinging to my arm. Then, just before dusk, we saw it. Standing at the edge of the firelight was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. For a moment I thought it was a person, but then it moved. The jerky, unnatural way it stepped closer made my stomach churn. Its face was wrong, like it had been stretched over a skull that didn't fit. "Don't move," Noah whispered. He crouched near the fire and grabbed a stick, thrusting it into the flames. The creature tilted its head like it was studying us. Then, in Connor's voice, it said, "Rachel, come here. I need your help." Connor went pale. "What the—" "Stay near the fire," Noah hissed. "They don't like fire." The creature circled us, staying just beyond the light. It was toying with us, watching, waiting. When it spoke again, it was Maddie's voice this time. "Please, I'm lost. Help me." Panic set in. Connor tried to throw a rock at it, but the creature didn't even flinch. I grabbed Maddie and pulled her closer to the fire, my heart pounding. "What does it want?" I whispered. "It's testing us," Noah said grimly. "Looking for someone to follow it." "Why?" Maddie's voice was barely audible. "To kill us, or worse." When it finally lunged, it was Connor who acted first. He grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it at the creature, driving it back into the shadows. Noah scrambled to build the flames higher, and I grabbed anything I could find to keep the fire going. The creature let out a terrible, inhuman scream that echoed through the forest. For a moment, I thought it might retreat, but then it darted forward again, its clawed hand swiping just inches from Connor's face. The stench of decay filled the air, so strong it made me gag. Finally, with one last scream, the creature vanished into the trees. We didn't sleep that night. At dawn, we packed up and followed the sun until we finally stumbled onto a trail that led to the park's main road. I don't know how we made it out, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back to Sterling Forest again. Even now, weeks later, I hear whispers when I'm alone. And sometimes, late at night, I think I see glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. Whatever was in those woods, it's not done with me yet. My name is Logan Hayes. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a photojournalist. What I'm about to tell you happened last fall, in October. I was traveling alone in my RV through New York, photographing remote wilderness areas for a personal project. At the time, I was dealing with a lot. My partner and I had split up a few months earlier, and honestly, I wasn't handling it well. This trip was supposed to clear my head, give me some space to think. Instead, it nearly killed me. It all started when I arrived at Pharaoh Lake Wilderness area in the Adirondacks. I'd read about the lake's stillness and beauty, about the way the fall colors reflected off the water like a mirror. But what drew me in wasn't just the scenery. I'd also heard whispers of strange things happening there. Missing hikers, old ruins deep in the woods, a so-called watcher, tied to local legends. I didn't believe in any of that, of course. I wanted photos, not ghost stories. I parked my RV near the trailhead on a Friday afternoon. The air was cold and sharp. carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. The lake was a 5-mile hike in, so I packed my camera gear and some essentials into a day pack, planning to spend the night by the water. A grizzled park ranger named Warren stopped me before I set out. "You camping out there?" he asked, his weathered face serious. "Yeah," I said, "just one night." He shook his head slowly. "Not a good idea. People say the lake's cursed. Strange things happen after dark." I smiled politely, brushing it off. "I'll keep an eye out." He sighed and handed me a map. "Stick to the marked trails, and if you see or hear anything unusual, don't investigate, just leave." I nodded, thanked him, and started walking. The trail to the lake was peaceful at first. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the occasional bird call broke the silence. About an hour in, I met another hiker, a young woman named Marcy. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with a worn backpack and a weathered smile. "You headed to the lake too?" she asked. "Yeah, doing some photography," I said. "You?" "Just exploring," she said. Then, after a pause, "Be careful out there." "Why does everyone keep saying that?" I joked. She didn't laugh. "Pharaoh Lake's not normal. If you see anything weird, don't follow it. Just a tip." Before I could ask what she meant, she waved and disappeared down a side trail. I reached the lake as the sun was setting. It was breathtaking. Calm water reflecting the fiery reds and oranges of the surrounding trees. I set up my tent near the shore and took a few shots of the golden light fading into dusk. But something about the place felt heavy, like the silence wasn't natural. While exploring the area, I stumbled across an old, weathered doll half buried in the dirt near the shore. Its porcelain face was cracked, and one eye was missing. I picked it up, feeling a chill run down my spine, and set it on a nearby rock. The woods seemed to grow darker after that. That night, things got strange. It started with whispers. Faint, almost inaudible, like the wind was carrying fragments of words. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they seemed to come from all around me. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling my tent. I unzipped the flap and shone my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. No tracks, no movement. I lay awake for hours, heart pounding. Around 2 a.m., I heard a child crying. The sound was distant, coming from the direction of the lake. I knew it couldn't be real. There weren't any other campers around, but something inside me twisted, urging me to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The lake was eerily calm, the moonlight casting a silver sheen across its surface. That's when I saw it. A figure standing knee-deep in the water. It was a child, or at least it looked like one, its face obscured by shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there staring at me. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hey!" I called out, my voice cracking. The figure turned and walked deeper into the lake, disappearing beneath the surface. The whispers returned, louder now, like they were coming from inside my head. The next morning, I tried to leave, but the trail seemed wrong. No matter which path I took, I kept looping back to the lake. I checked my GPS, but it refused to load. Even my compass spun uselessly, as if magnetized by something unseen. Around midday, I stumbled upon an old cabin hidden in the woods. Its roof was partially collapsed, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. Inside, I found crumbling papers and a journal belonging to a settler named Joseph Albright. The entries grew more frantic as I read, detailing how his community had been cursed during a brutal winter. People had turned on each other, driven mad by whispers in the woods and visions of a shadowy figure they called the Watcher. One entry chilled me to my core, We cannot leave. The Watcher holds us here, tethered to this place. It takes our faces, our voices. It consumes us." That night, the Watcher came for me. I was sitting by my campfire trying to stay calm when I saw it, a shadow moving at the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it stepped closer. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its eyes glowed like embers. My breath caught in my throat as it spoke, using Marcy's voice. "Logan, come with me." I couldn't move. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows across its distorted form. Then it shifted, and suddenly it was speaking with my ex's voice. "You're not good enough. You never were." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The Watcher circled me, its presence suffocating, its whispers burrowing into my mind. Finally, instinct took over. I grabbed my camera and fired the flash. The burst of light made the creature recoil, its form dissolving momentarily into smoke. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my gear and ran. The forest seemed alive, the trees shifting and closing in as I stumbled through the darkness. The Watcher pursued me, its shadowy tendrils reaching out, brushing against my skin like icy fingers. My camera flash was the only thing keeping it at bay, but the battery was dying fast. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw her, Marcy, standing at the trailhead. She held up a small talisman carved from bone and muttered something under her breath. The Watcher stopped, its form wavering, and then it vanished into the trees. "You shouldn't have come here," Marcy said, her voice trembling. "Take this and leave. Now." I didn't ask questions. I took the talisman, thanked her, and bolted back to my RV. By the time I reached the highway, dawn was breaking. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Weeks later, I reviewed the photos I'd taken at Pharaoh Lake. In several of them, I saw a shadowy figure lurking in the background, its glowing eyes fixed on me. And in one photo, taken inside my RV, I saw the doll from the lake, sitting on the passenger seat. I haven't been able to sleep since. Wherever I go, I feel its eyes watching, waiting. My name is Caleb Brooks, and I'm 34 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened last October, when I set out on a solo RV trip to Indian Head Mountain in the Catskills. At the time, I was a burned-out travel writer trying to find my spark again. My life had become an endless loop of resort reviews and beach destination guides, and I needed something real, something raw, to remind me why I started writing in the first place. Indian Head, with its wild trails and rumored legends, seemed like the perfect choice. I should have turned back the moment I got there. The day started off fine enough. I parked my RV at the trailhead and double-checked my gear, water, snacks, my journal, and my camera. I wanted to camp near the summit, where I could catch the sunset and maybe write something meaningful for the first time in years. At a small general store a few miles from the trail, I met a woman named Amara. She was about my age, with a sharp, confident look about her. We struck up a conversation while I grabbed some supplies. "You heading up Indian Head?" she asked, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, hoping to spend the night up there. Get some inspiration." Her smile faltered. "Be careful. That mountain's different. People say you have to respect it. Don't disturb anything that feels out of place. And definitely don't stay past dark without leaving an offering." I chuckled nervously. "An offering? Like what?" She shrugged. "Something that means something to you, trust me." I chalked it up to local superstition and paid for my supplies, but her words stayed with me. Something about her tone suggested she wasn't joking. When I arrived at the trailhead, an older man named Ray was managing the parking lot. He wore a faded ranger's cap and a jacket that looked like it had seen a few decades of hard use. He greeted me with a gruff nod and looked over my gear. "Overnight?" he asked. "Yeah, planning to camp near the summit." Ray squinted at me. "You heard the stories about Indian Head?" "Let me guess. Don't go alone, don't stay after dark, and leave an offering," I said with a laugh, recalling what Amara had told me. His expression didn't change. "You think it's funny now. You won't if you see it." "See what?" He leaned in closer, his voice low. "The devil of Indian Head. Big red eyes. Hooves. Likes to mess with people. Make 'em lose their minds. That mountain doesn't let you leave unless it gets what it wants." I wanted to dismiss him, but the intensity in his voice made my stomach turn. Still, I wasn't about to let a ghost story ruin my plans. I thanked him, hoisted my pack, and started up the trail. The hike was tougher than I'd expected. The trail wound through dense woods, the kind where sunlight barely reaches the ground. The air felt heavy, like the mountain was pressing down on me. About an hour in, I noticed strange claw marks on some of the trees, deep, deliberate scratches that didn't look natural. I told myself it was probably just a bear or a cougar, but the sight made me uneasy. Then my GPS started acting up. The signal cut out and the screen froze, leaving me with no sense of direction. Luckily, I'd brought a paper map, so I kept going, chalking the glitches up to bad reception. Near dusk, I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. The tent was shredded, its poles bent like they'd been snapped by something strong. Clothes and gear were scattered everywhere, and there was no sign of the campers. Among the wreckage, I found a notebook. The pages were filled with frantic, scrawled entries. "Red eyes in the dark. They're watching me. It knows I'm here. It wants something." I dropped the notebook and backed away, my pulse racing. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the silence pressing in like a weight. I told myself it was just paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I reached a rocky outcrop near the summit, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The view was incredible. Rolling hills bathed in golden light, the sky streaked with pink and orange. For a moment, I forgot about the eerie campsite and the scratches on the trees. I set up my tent and started a small fire, eager to capture the scene in words. But as night fell, the atmosphere changed. The first sign was the smell, something acrid and metallic, like burning hair. Then came the growls. Low and guttural, they echoed through the trees, too deep to belong to any animal I'd ever heard. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness, but the beam only illuminated shifting shadows. Then I saw them. 2 glowing red eyes staring at me from the tree line. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just watched. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. The eyes disappeared and the growls stopped. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But when I turned back to my fire, I saw hoofprints in the dirt, smoldering faintly as if they'd been burned into the ground. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard whispers, low, insistent, like voices carried on the wind. By dawn, I was exhausted and ready to leave, but when I tried to find the trail back down, nothing looked familiar. The woods seemed to twist and shift, leading me in circles. My compass spun uselessly, and my map might as well have been blank. Desperate, I wandered deeper into the forest, hoping to find a landmark. Instead, I came across a stone altar. It was ancient, covered in moss, and surrounded by offerings. Coins, trinkets, even a locket with a faded photograph inside. The sight made my skin crawl. I remembered Ray's warning about leaving an offering. But what did I have to give? Nothing I carried felt significant enough. That's when the devil appeared. It stepped out of the shadows, its form impossibly tall and twisted. Its eyes burned like embers, and its body was a grotesque mix of human and animal. Horns curling from its head, hooves where its feet should have been. The air around it felt cold and heavy, like all the warmth had been sucked away. "You've trespassed," it said, its voice low and guttural. "This mountain demands tribute." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The devil circled me, its presence overwhelming. "Your words," it growled, "your passion. Leave them here, or you'll never leave this place." It pointed to my journal, the one thing that had kept me tethered to my craft. My heart sank. Without that journal, without my writing, who was I? But I had no choice. With shaking hands, I placed the journal on the altar. The devil loomed over me, its red eyes burning into my soul. Then, with a final growl, it vanished, leaving me alone in the cold, silent woods. I found the trailhead at dawn, though I don't remember how I got there. My RV was untouched, and Ray was nowhere to be seen. I drove away as fast as I could, the weight of what I'd left behind pressing on my chest. Weeks later, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a photo of the stone altar, my journal resting on it. The message was clear. The mountain wasn't done with me. I haven't been back to Indian Head since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers in the wind and smell that acrid, metallic scent, and I wonder, how long can I stay away before the devil calls me back? My name is Megan Evans. I'm 27, and I've always prided myself on being organized, practical, and the kind of person who thrives in nature. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened during our camping trip in the remote forest near Old Forge, New York. I haven't been able to sleep since that weekend, and every time I close my eyes, I see it. The thing that stalked us, the thing that almost killed us. It started as a casual getaway with my boyfriend, Chris, and my best friend, Sarah. We'd been planning a trip to escape the city for months. I found what I thought was the perfect spot, a secluded campsite near a lake in the Adirondacks. Chris loved adventure, and Sarah, though quieter, always said she found peace in the woods. I thought it would be a chance for us to reconnect. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, the three of us crammed into Chris's RV. The drive had been long, and the last stretch was on an unmarked dirt road that wound through dense forest. By the time we found the campsite, we were all eager to get out and stretch our legs. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Too quiet. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. The lake, though beautiful, was still as glass, its surface reflecting the overcast sky. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. Chris parked the RV, and we started setting up camp. As I gathered firewood, I spotted claw marks on a tree near the edge of the clearing. They were deep and uneven, as if something with massive claws had raked the bark. "Probably a bear," Chris said when I pointed them out. He was always so dismissive of my concerns. "We're in the woods, Megan. Relax." I wanted to argue, but Sarah chimed in. "It's probably nothing," she said, though her tone was uncertain. That night, as we sat around the campfire, the unease I'd felt earlier began to creep back. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees like a low, mournful howl. It was cold, colder than it should have been for early autumn, and the fire didn't seem to help much. We were halfway through our second round of s'mores when we heard it. A branch snapping, loud and deliberate. Chris grabbed a flashlight and scanned the tree line, but all we saw were shadows. "It's probably just a raccoon," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. I didn't sleep well that night. The wind seemed to carry faint whispers, and every so often I'd hear the crunch of leaves, as if something was circling the RV. The next morning, we found the cooler overturned, its contents scattered across the clearing. The footprints around it weren't human or animal. They were large, misshapen, and oddly spaced, like whatever made them walked on two legs, but didn't quite know how. I wanted to leave, but Chris insisted it was nothing to worry about. We didn't come all this way to turn back because of some weird footprints, he said. Sarah and I reluctantly agreed to stay. We spent the day hiking along a nearby trail, though the eerie silence of the forest made it hard to enjoy the scenery. About a mile in, we stumbled upon a strange sight, a pile of animal bones arranged in a circle. Some were cracked open, the marrow scraped clean. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It's just hunters or something," Chris said, though he avoided looking at the bones for too long. That night, the real terror began. We were sitting around the campfire again, trying to shake off the unease of the day, when we heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and much too close. Chris grabbed the flashlight and stood up. "I'm going to check it out," he said, before I could stop him. He disappeared into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight bobbing as he walked. Minutes passed, and the sounds of the forest seemed to close in around us. Then, suddenly, Chris screamed. Sarah and I bolted from our chairs, calling his name. He stumbled back into the clearing, pale and shaking. I saw something," he stammered. "It was standing there, just staring at me. It looked human, but wrong." He wouldn't elaborate, and I didn't press him. Instead, I suggested we lock ourselves in the RV for the night. As we sat inside, the atmosphere grew tense. Chris stared out the window, his hands trembling. Sarah huddled next to me, her fear palpable. Then came the voices. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a faint, distorted version of my own voice calling from the forest. "Megan, help me." Chris stiffened. "Did you hear that?" We all froze as Sarah's voice echoed from the woods, pleading and broken. "Please, I'm lost." "It's not real," I whispered, though my heart was pounding. "It's trying to mess with us." The next morning, Chris was a wreck. He claimed he'd seen his father, who had died years ago, standing by the lake. "He told me to come to him," Chris said, his voice cracking. I almost did. We decided to leave, but when Chris tried to start the RV, it wouldn't turn over. Frustrated, he checked under the hood and found the engine torn apart, as if by claws. "It doesn't want us to leave," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. As night fell, we built the fire higher and gathered what weapons we could, a hatchet, a camping knife, and a makeshift torch. We stayed close to the fire, the only thing that seemed to keep the creature at bay. Then it came. At first, it was just a shadow moving between the trees. Then we saw it clearly. A gaunt, humanoid figure with glowing eyes and elongated limbs. Its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged teeth. The Wendigo. It circled the clearing, its movements unnaturally fast. At one point, it lunged toward us, but the fire seemed to repel it. Sarah screamed as it slashed at her arm, leaving a deep, icy burn. Chris swung the hatchet wildly, and I grabbed the gasoline canister, pouring it onto the fire to create a massive blaze. The creature let out an unearthly scream and retreated into the shadows. We didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I managed to patch the engine just enough to get the RV running. We drove out of that cursed forest as fast as we could, the creature's glowing eyes watching us from the tree line. We survived, but we weren't unscathed. Sarah still has nightmares, and Chris hasn't been the same since. As for me, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. If you ever find yourself near Old Forge, do yourself a favor. Stay on the beaten path, because some things in the woods are better left undiscovered. My name is Mia Harrington. I'm 32 years old, and this happened last October during what was supposed to be a peaceful solo trip to Leworth State Park in New York. I had just quit my job in advertising to pursue my dream of wildlife photography, and I thought this trip would be the perfect way to reset and focus on building my portfolio. I've camped alone before, but I've never experienced anything like what happened that weekend. I arrived at the park late on a Thursday afternoon, my RV loaded with camping gear, camera equipment, and enough supplies for 3 days. I had deliberately chosen a remote campsite near a smaller, less popular gorge, thinking the solitude would inspire creativity. The drive-in was beautiful, with the trees painted in fiery reds and golds, but the road became increasingly narrow and uneven the farther I went. By the time I reached the campsite, the forest felt like it was closing in, the canopy casting deep shadows despite the fading sunlight. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, heavy stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I told myself it was just the quiet of the wilderness, nothing more, and got to work setting up camp. I was tightening the last tent stake when a park ranger showed up. She was young, probably a few years younger than me, with sharp, no-nonsense eyes and a badge that read Marks. "Evening," she said, tipping her hat. "You planning to stay here long?" "Just a few days," I replied, brushing dirt off my hands. "Is there a problem?" "Not a problem," she said, but there was hesitation in her voice. "Just be careful, stick to marked trails, and if you hear anything strange, don't follow it." I raised an eyebrow. "Anything strange?" She seemed to regret saying it and quickly added, "Just stay safe. These woods can be unpredictable." With that cryptic warning, she left, and I was alone again. I tried to shake off the unease her words had stirred, but it lingered in the back of my mind as I prepared for the night. The first sign that something wasn't right came the next morning. I woke early, eager to catch the golden hour for some shots of the waterfalls. The air was crisp, and the light filtered through the trees in perfect beams. I followed a marked trail toward the gorge, camera in hand, when I noticed strange carvings on a tree. They looked like symbols, circles, spirals, and crude animal shapes, etched deeply into the bark. I snapped a picture, thinking they might be remnants of some old Native American art, though something about them felt off. The unease deepened as I hiked further. The forest was too quiet. Even the sound of my own footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by the dense trees. About halfway to the gorge, I heard a faint sound, a whisper, carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the rustling of leaves, but as I paused to listen, I realized it was a voice. "Mia." I froze. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the breeze, but I was certain it had spoken my name. My rational mind took over. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe combined with my own nerves, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. That afternoon, I met a couple camping in an RV not far from mine. Tom and Lisa Reynolds were in their late 40s, friendly and full of stories about their travels. I mentioned the carvings and the whispering, and Tom's expression darkened. "You ever hear of the Ghost Boy?" he asked. I shook my head. "Legend says a boy drowned near the waterfalls years ago," Lisa chimed in. "People say his spirit haunts the park, looking for someone to keep him company. He's harmless at first, just whispers and shadows. But if you follow him, you don't come back." I laughed nervously, unsure if they were teasing me or not. Tom's face was serious, though, and Lisa gave me a look that made the hairs on my neck stand up. That night, the whispers returned. I was sitting in my RV, reviewing the day's photos, when I heard it again. "Mia, come play." The voice was soft, almost childlike, but distorted, as if coming from underwater. My stomach churned as I glanced out the window. The forest was dark, the trees casting long, jagged shadows under the moonlight. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the clearing. Nothing. I locked the doors and spent the rest of the night jumping at every creak and rustle. The next morning, I decided to venture deeper into the woods to distract myself. I found a smaller, overgrown trail that wasn't marked on my map and decided to explore. About a mile in, I stumbled upon something strange. A single child's shoe, half buried in the mud. It looked old and weathered, as if it had been there for decades. A wave of sadness washed over me, inexplicable and suffocating. As I stood there, the whispers began again, louder this time. "Mia, help me!" The voice was pleading now, almost desperate. My heart hammered in my chest as I scanned the trees, but the forest seemed to close in around me, the light dimming despite the midday sun. I turned and hurried back to camp, the feeling of being watched prickling at my back the entire way. That night, the whispers turned into tapping. I was lying in bed when I heard it. Soft, rhythmic taps on the RV windows. My breath caught as I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The light reflected off empty glass, but the tapping continued, moving from one window to the next. Then I saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was small, childlike, but wrong. Its limbs were too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out its face, but I felt its gaze, heavy and cold. I slammed the blind shut and didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my gear and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Frustrated, I walked to Tom and Lisa's campsite for help, only to find it abandoned. Their chairs were overturned, their fire pit scattered, and strange symbols, like the ones I'd seen on the tree, were etched into the side of their RV. Panic set in. I ran back to my own RV, only to find muddy footprints leading up to the door. Inside, the air was freezing, and the windows were fogged. Written in the condensation were the words, "Stay with me." My blood ran cold. I grabbed my flashlight and camera and bolted, heading toward the ranger station. Ranger Marks wasn't there, but her desk was covered in missing persons flyers, all from the past few years. My hands shook as I recognized one of the names. It was Tom Reynolds. That night was the worst. The whispers turned to screams, and the shadow returned, pounding on the windows and shaking the RV. Desperate, I remembered what Tom and Lisa had said about the ghost boy's connection to the waterfalls. I grabbed my gear and ran toward the gorge, the flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. When I reached the waterfall, I found an old memorial hidden behind the rocks, a rusted cross surrounded by decaying toys and wilted flowers. I shone my light on it and whispered, "I'm sorry. I'll tell your story. Please let me go." The air grew still, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then the boy appeared, his form flickering like a dying flame. His eyes were hollow, and water dripped from his tattered clothes. "Don't leave me," he whispered, his voice raw with pain. I held my ground, tears streaming down my face. "You're not alone," I said, "but you have to rest." He let out a mournful wail before dissolving into the mist. The next morning, the RV started without issue. I drove out of the park, glancing in the rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see the boy watching me. Days later, I reviewed my photos and found him faintly visible in several shots, a shadow at the edge of the frame, always watching. I haven't been back to Letchworth since. But sometimes, when the wind whispers through the trees, I still hear his voice. Come back soon. My name is Evan Mitchell, and I'm 35 years old. I've spent the better part of my life chasing the thrill of the wilderness, testing myself against the elements, and thriving off the grid. But nothing I'd learned in all those years prepared me for what happened in Sugar Hill State Forest last summer. I tell myself I survived because I'm resourceful, but deep down, I know it was pure luck. This story isn't just a warning, it's my confession. It started as one of my regular solo trips. I'd read about a remote section of Sugar Hill near Watkins Glen, a place supposedly untouched by crowds and perfect for a week of testing new survival gear. I parked my RV in a secluded clearing surrounded by towering pines and oaks. The air was thick with the smell of earth and moss, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. It was perfect. By the time I set up camp, dusk was settling over the forest. The light filtering through the canopy bathed everything in gold, and for a moment I felt a familiar sense of peace. That peace shattered when I found the sign. It was nailed to a nearby tree, weathered and faded but still legible. Turn back, not safe after dark. I chuckled nervously. Probably some old joke left by hikers to spook the superstitious, I thought. I took a picture of it with my phone and moved on. That night, as I sat by the fire, the forest seemed to change. The temperature dropped sharply, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures faded until there was only silence. It was unnatural, the kind of quiet that sets your instincts on edge. I told myself it was the isolation messing with me, but then I heard it. A faint, distant sound, like muffled laughter. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but the beam only cut through the nearest trees. The laughter stopped, replaced by soft murmurs that seemed to circle the camp. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease by exploring a nearby trail. About a mile in, I spotted something strange. Bare footprints pressed into the soft dirt, leading off the trail and into the woods. They were human-like but large, the toes elongated in a way that made my stomach churn. I followed the prints for a few yards before they vanished abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply disappeared. Shaking my head, I turned back toward the main trail and nearly collided with someone. "Whoa," a woman said, stepping back. She was in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail and a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." "No worries," I said, though my heart was still racing. She introduced herself as Danny, another solo camper staying nearby. We started walking together, and she told me she was a horror novelist, camping to find inspiration for her next book. When I mentioned the footprints, her expression grew serious. "You've heard the legend, right?" she asked. I shook my head. Locals call them the Hunters of the Forgotten. Supposedly, they were settlers who slaughtered an innocent family during colonial times. The story goes that the forest cursed them, turning them into revenants who stalk anyone who intrudes on their territory. I laughed, trying to hide my discomfort. "That's colorful." She shrugged. "Just don't go wandering too far off the trails. Better safe than sorry." That night, the laughter returned, louder this time and more distinct. I sat in my RV, flashlight in one hand and knife in the other, scanning the windows for any sign of movement. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I dreamed of being chased, dark shapes darting between the trees, glowing eyes fixed on me. I woke with a start to find deep scratches etched into the side of my RV. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was an animal. I met up with Danny again and shared what had happened. She didn't seem surprised. "It's probably just some prankster," she said, but there was doubt in her voice. I noticed her campsite was littered with crumpled pieces of paper. She admitted she hadn't been able to focus on her writing. "Something about this place feels wrong," she said. As we talked, I caught movement in the trees behind her. A figure, thin and wiry, with an uneven gait, stood just out of reach of the sunlight. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "See what?" When I told her, her expression darkened. "You should leave," she said. That evening, I returned to my campsite, determined to pack up and go in the morning. As I sat by the fire, a man emerged from the woods. He was gaunt, his clothes tattered, and his eyes darted nervously. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Who are you?" I asked, standing and gripping my knife tightly. "They'll come for you," he said. "They always do." Before I could respond, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. I searched for him but found no trace. That night, all hell broke loose. The laughter turned to screams, echoing from all directions. Shadows darted around the campsite, their movements unnaturally fast. My fire, which had been burning brightly moments before, sputtered and dimmed as a chill swept through the clearing. I locked myself in the RV, but it was no use. The creatures came. Tall, twisted forms with glowing eyes and elongated limbs. They surrounded the RV, scratching at the windows and whispering in voices that sounded like my own. "Why did you let them die, Evan?" one voice said, sharp and accusing. I gritted my teeth, refusing to let the guilt take hold. "You're not real," I whispered. The RV shook violently, and I knew I had to act. I grabbed a gas canister and a lighter, rigging a makeshift torch. When I stepped outside, the figures recoiled, their glowing eyes narrowing. I swung the torch wildly, forcing them back as I ran toward Danny's campsite. I found her huddled by her own fire, surrounded by the same shadowy forms. She looked up at me, her face pale with terror. Together, we used our torches to drive the creatures back, inching our way toward the main road. The hunters didn't give up easily. They screamed and clawed at us, their forms flickering like dying flames. But as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, they dissolved into mist, leaving only silence behind. Danny and I made it back to civilization, but we were both shaken. We didn't exchange numbers or promise to stay in touch. Some experiences are too raw to relive. I sold the RV a week later. But sometimes when I'm alone, I hear them. The whispers, faint but unmistakable. They're still out there waiting. My name is Mia Carter, and I'm 28 years old. I'm a freelance photographer with a love for capturing the untamed beauty of nature. But what happened last fall in the dense woods of Indian Head Mountain still haunts me. I haven't been able to go on another camping trip since. I need to tell this story, not because I think anyone will believe me, but because I have to get it out of my head. This happened in October of last year. My boyfriend, Brandon, and I decided to spend a long weekend camping in the Wyndham Blackhead Range wilderness, nestled deep in the Catskills of New York. I wanted to document the golden hues of fall for a magazine spread, and Brandon, always the practical one, thought it would be a good chance to unplug from work and reconnect. We loaded up the RV, packed just enough supplies for 3 days, and hit the road. The first day was uneventful. We parked the RV at the trailhead and hiked a few miles to set up camp near a clearing that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. The air was crisp and clean, and the forest was alive with the rustle of leaves and the calls of birds. Brandon made a fire, grumbling a bit about the cold, while I wandered off to take pictures of the sunset filtering through the trees. It was peaceful. Too peaceful in hindsight. I first noticed something odd when I found a skull half buried in the dirt just off the trail. It was small, maybe from a raccoon or a fox, but something about it made my skin crawl. The way it was positioned, with its hollow eyes staring directly at the path, felt deliberate. I snapped a photo and walked away quickly, pretending it was nothing. That night, as we lay in the tent, I heard what sounded like a baby crying in the distance. It was faint but distinct, a high-pitched wail cutting through the stillness. I nudged Brandon awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" he mumbled, half asleep. "That crying. It sounds like a baby." He groaned and turned over. "Probably just a bird or something. Go back to sleep." I wanted to believe him, but something about the sound was wrong. It didn't fade like normal noises do in the woods. It just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. The next morning, I found strange footprints around our campsite. They were human-like but oddly elongated, with toes that seemed too long. I showed them to Brandon. "Probably just some weird hiker with those toe shoe things," he said dismissively. "Who hikes out here barefoot?" I asked, but he just shrugged. We spent the day hiking to a higher vantage point. I noticed more of those strange footprints along the trail, and at one point I thought I saw someone watching us from the tree line. It was just a shadowy figure, tall and thin, but when I turned to get a better look, it was gone. Brandon didn't see it, of course. He was too busy fiddling with the GPS. When we returned to camp, we found our gear had been disturbed. Nothing was missing, but our food bags had been moved, and the firewood pile we'd neatly stacked the night before was scattered across the clearing. "Probably a raccoon," Brandon said, though his voice lacked confidence. That night, the whispers started. They were faint at first, just at the edge of hearing. I thought it was the wind until I realized the whispers were saying my name. "Mia!" I shook Brandon awake. "Do you hear that?" I hissed. He sat up, listening. The whispers had stopped. "You're imagining things," he said, but his eyes darted nervously around the tent. "Let's just get some sleep." Neither of us slept much that night. By the third day, even Brandon couldn't deny that something was wrong. As we hiked back to the RV, the woods seemed darker than they should have been, the trees closing in around us. We kept finding animal skulls, too many to dismiss as coincidence, and they were always arranged in strange patterns, like little altars. "Mia, stop taking pictures of those," Brandon snapped after the fourth or fifth skull. "Let's just get out of here." But we didn't. Somehow, despite following the GPS, we ended up back at the same clearing where we'd camped. It didn't make any sense. Brandon swore he'd been following the right trail, but the forest seemed to shift around us, like it was alive. Then, just before dusk, we saw it. At first, it looked like a deer standing at the edge of the clearing, its antlers catching the last rays of sunlight. But as it stepped closer, we realized it wasn't a deer at all. Its body was too human, its limbs too long and thin. Its face, God, its face was almost human, but the eyes were empty hollows that seemed to swallow the light. Brandon grabbed my arm. "We need to go, now!" We sprinted to the RV, not looking back. When we reached it, we found the doors wide open, though we were sure we'd locked them. Inside, the seats were slashed, and our supplies were scattered everywhere. Then we heard it, a voice calling from the woods. "Mia, Brandon." It was my voice, but distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. We barricaded ourselves in the RV, locking every door and window. Outside, we could hear the creatures, there were more than one now, circling the vehicle. They tapped on the windows and scraped their claws along the sides, mimicking our voices with eerie precision. "Mia, let me in," one of them said, sounding exactly like Brandon. But he was sitting right next to me, pale and shaking. Then the power went out. The darkness was absolute and the tapping grew louder, more insistent. One of them managed to tear open the rear window, its skeletal arm reaching inside. Brandon grabbed a camping knife and slashed at it, and it let out an unearthly scream before retreating. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice trembling. "We have to drive." I jumped into the driver's seat while Brandon held the knife, ready for another attack. The RV roared to life, and I floored it, crashing through the underbrush as the creatures chased us. I could see them in the rearview mirror, their hollow eyes glowing in the dark. One of them leapt onto the back of the RV, its claws scraping against the roof, but Brandon managed to stab it through the broken window and it fell away. Somehow, we made it back to the highway. The creatures didn't follow us past the tree line, but their presence lingered. We didn't stop until we reached a small diner on the outskirts of town, where we collapsed into a booth, shaken and bloodied. I haven't been back to the woods since. The photos I took on that trip are still on my camera, but I can't bring myself to look at them. Sometimes I hear whispers in the dead of night, and I wonder if we truly escaped, or if something followed us home. If you're ever tempted to camp at Indian Head Mountain, don't. There are things in those woods that no one can explain, and they're not meant to be disturbed. Trust me, I learned the hard way. My name is Ryan Blake. I'm 33 years old, and I've spent more time alone in the wilderness than most people spend in their backyards. I pride myself on being prepared, on knowing how to survive. But what happened to me last November in Black Hollow, deep in the Adirondack wilderness, showed me just how fragile that confidence was. I don't know if I'll ever go back into the woods again. This happened when I decided to spend a week alone in a remote part of the Adirondacks, testing my survival skills. I'd been here once before, years ago, but I remembered it as peaceful and untouched. This time, I drove my RV to the farthest trailhead, parked, and hiked for hours until I reached a secluded campsite near a ravine. I wanted solitude. I thought I'd find clarity. Instead, I found something else, something hungry. The first day passed uneventfully. I set up my tent, filtered water from a nearby stream, and scouted the area. It was cold, and the air smelled like damp leaves and distant snow. Perfect conditions, or so I thought. By nightfall, I had a fire crackling and I was cooking a simple meal. The silence of the forest was comforting, the kind of quiet that wraps around you and lets your mind settle. That night, as I lay in my tent, I heard a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't even natural. It was a deep, guttural groan, low and resonant, like the earth itself was straining to speak. It echoed faintly through the ravine. I told myself it was just the wind funneling through the rocks. I wanted to believe that. The next morning, I found something odd near the stream where I'd been filtering water. A pile of rocks carefully stacked into a crude pyramid. It wasn't there the day before. It looked deliberate. Human. I took a photo with my phone and tried to laugh it off. Maybe some kids had wandered through here, I told myself. Still, the arrangement felt wrong, like it was meant to warn me. I spent most of the day exploring the surrounding forest and taking pictures. As the sun dipped lower, I found an old, overgrown campsite not far from mine. The remains of a fire pit were still visible, surrounded by scattered gear. An abandoned backpack, a torn sleeping bag. The backpack had a name tag, Sam. Inside, I found a tattered journal with frantic entries written in pencil. The last entry stopped me cold. "They're watching. Don't eat anything you find. They'll know. They'll take you." I felt the hair on my neck rise. I scanned the trees around me, suddenly certain I wasn't alone. But the woods were still. Too still. I woke up to find my water filter clogged. The stream was murky with debris, likely from recent rain. I cursed under my breath and boiled water instead, knowing it wouldn't taste great but would keep me hydrated. The frustration rattled me more than it should have. As I packed up my gear to explore farther from camp, I noticed claw-like marks on several trees nearby. They weren't animal scratches. They were deliberate, as if something with hands had raked them deep into the bark. Each tree bore the same symbol, a crude figure with emaciated limbs reaching outward. By mid-afternoon, I saw it, the shadow. It was standing between the trees, a tall, gaunt figure that didn't move like a person should. Its arms were too long, its limbs too thin. I froze, gripping my camera like a lifeline. Through the lens, it looked even worse. Its face was pale, hollow-eyed, and devoid of humanity. Before I could take the shot, it vanished. I stumbled back to my camp just as dusk was falling, my heart racing. I wasn't alone. A woman was there, crouched by the remains of my fire. She looked disheveled, her hair tangled, her clothes dirty and torn. She turned when she heard me, her eyes wide and frantic. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound steady. "Claire," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, you have to help me. My son, he's out here. We've been lost for days." I hesitated. She didn't look dangerous, just scared out of her mind. "Where's your camp?" She shook her head. "It's gone. They took it. They're hunting us." "Who's they?" I asked, but she wouldn't answer. Instead, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You can't eat anything out here, nothing. Not the plants, not the animals, not even the water. It's cursed. They'll mark you." Her words made no sense, but her fear was infectious. I let her stay at my camp for the night, though I barely slept, listening to her mutter about spirits and curses. Outside the tent, the forest was alive with unnatural sounds, low groans, rustling that didn't match the wind, and distant, guttural laughter. Claire begged me to help her find her son Sam. She described him as a tall, wiry teenager with sandy hair. I agreed, more out of guilt than hope. I packed what I could carry, leaving behind the heavier gear, and we set off into the woods. The deeper we went, the worse the forest became. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, and the trees more twisted. We found more of those claw-marked symbols, and once I saw a movement in the corner of my eye, a flash of something pale and impossibly fast. Claire started to panic. "He's here," she whispered. "I can feel him." When we found him, it wasn't what I expected. He was standing in a clearing, his back to us. At first, I thought he was fine, but as we got closer, I saw the truth. His body was emaciated, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His head turned and his face was a nightmare. Hollow cheeks, blackened lips, and eyes like dark pits. "Mom," he rasped, his voice inhumanly low. "You left me." Claire screamed, rushing toward him, but I grabbed her arm. "That's not him," I shouted. "Stay back." Sam, or whatever he had become, moved unnaturally, his limbs jerking as he advanced, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and he spoke again. But it wasn't his voice anymore. It was mine. "Ryan, help me." I didn't think, I acted. Swinging the hatchet I'd brought, I struck at the thing wearing Sam's face. It shrieked, an ear-splitting wail that echoed through the forest. Claire fell to her knees, sobbing, as the creature staggered back, black ichor dripping from its wound. "Run!" I shouted, pulling her to her feet. We fled through the twisted trees, the wails of the Wendigo, or whatever it was, following us. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at us, the air thick with the stench of decay. At one point, Claire tripped, and I had to drag her back up. She was mumbling incoherently, her mind shattered by what she'd seen. When we finally reached the RV, I thought we were safe. I was wrong. The RV was in chaos, the windows were fogged with handprints, and the air inside smelled of rot. I locked the doors and checked the fuel gauge. Half a tank, enough to get out of here. But as I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. "They won't let us leave," Claire whispered, clutching her knees. "We're theirs now." Outside, the creatures gathered. There were more of them now, their pale forms illuminated by the faint moonlight. They didn't attack, they just watched, their hollow eyes filled with malice. One of them approached the window, tapping the glass with a claw-like finger. Its mouth opened, and I heard my own voice. "Let me in." At some point, Claire fell silent. When I checked on her, she was dead, her face twisted in terror. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I got the RV started and drove until dawn. The creatures didn't follow me past the tree line, but I knew they were watching. Now, back in civilization, I can't shake the hunger. No matter how much I eat, it's never enough. And when I look in the mirror, my reflection isn't quite right. My eyes seem darker, my skin thinner. I think the curse is in me now, and I'm afraid it's hungry. My name is Heather Kane, and I'm 29 years old. Until last fall, I thought I knew myself, who I was, what I wanted, how I fit into the world. But something happened to me in the Catskills, at a place called Devil's Tombstone, that changed me forever. I don't talk about it with anyone. Honestly, I'm not even sure I believe it myself. But I need to tell someone. And maybe, if I put it into words, it'll stop haunting me. This happened in late October. I'd been through a rough breakup a few months before and decided I needed to get away. I wasn't an outdoorsy person by nature, but I'd spent the summer devouring books and YouTube videos about hiking, camping, and wilderness survival. It became my new obsession. I thought a weekend camping alone would help me reconnect with myself and prove I didn't need anyone else to feel whole. Devil's Tombstone seemed perfect, beautiful, remote, and just the right level of challenging for someone still finding their footing in the wild. I parked my RV in the campground and set out to explore the trails with nothing but a day pack and my growing confidence. The first day was fine, mostly. The air was crisp, the leaves a riot of red and gold. The mountains looked like they'd been dipped in fire. I hiked a popular trail toward the Hunter Mountain Fire Tower, taking photos, listening to the wind in the trees. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. Then I saw the totems. The first one was tucked just off the trail, a crude figure carved from wood about a foot tall, lashed to a tree with twine. It was shaped like a person but distorted, with limbs too long and a head that drooped unnaturally to one side. I stopped to look at it, taking a picture with my phone. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. The twine looked fresh, the wood recently cut. Farther down the trail I saw another totem, then another. Each one seemed more intricate, more sinister, as though they were telling a story I couldn't understand. That night, back at the RV, I told myself it was nothing, just some weird art project or a prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I closed the curtains before I went to bed. The next morning, I decided to explore a lesser-used trail I'd read about online. It wasn't marked on the official maps, but locals had mentioned it in forums as a hidden gem. The path was overgrown, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my boots crunching on the forest floor. I was so focused on the trail that I didn't hear them approach until they were right behind me. "Hey there!" a man's voice called, startling me. I turned to see a couple about my age. The man, Liam, was tall and broad-shouldered, with an easy grin. The woman, Tasha, was petite and athletic, her dark hair tied back in a braid. "Didn't mean to scare you," Liam said. "We saw your RV at the campground. Figured we weren't the only ones crazy enough to be out here." We walked together for a while, chatting. They were friendly, but something about their energy was off. Too eager. Tasha kept glancing over her shoulder, like she was expecting someone, or something, to appear. When I mentioned the totems, Liam laughed. "Oh yeah, those. Local legend says they're warnings, but it's just folklore, nothing to worry about." Tasha didn't laugh. She gave me a tight smile and said, "Folklore always starts somewhere." By late afternoon, we reached a clearing where the trail seemed to end. But I noticed something, a narrow, almost invisible path leading deeper into the woods. It wasn't on the map or mentioned in any of the forums I'd read. "Looks like it keeps going," I said. Liam grinned. "Let's check it out." Tasha hesitated. "I don't think we should, it's getting late." But Liam had already started down the path and I followed. Tasha sighed and came after us, muttering under her breath. The hidden trail wound through denser, darker forest. The air grew colder, and I started to notice more totems, larger now, carved with faces that looked almost human. One of them had a mouth open in a silent scream, its hollow eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Creepy," Liam said, snapping a photo, "but cool." I didn't say anything. My stomach was in knots. We found it just before sunset, a stone altar in the center of a small clearing, surrounded by more totems. The altar was covered in strange symbols carved deep into the rock, and the air around it felt heavy, like a thunderstorm was about to break. Liam approached it without hesitation. "Man, this is wild. Wonder what it's for." "Let's go," Tasha said, her voice sharp. "Now." I agreed, but Liam wasn't ready to leave. He climbed onto the altar, laughing as he struck a mock dramatic pose. "Behold, the king of the forest," he declared. The woods went silent. Completely, unnaturally silent. "Liam, get down," Tasha hissed. But before he could, we heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl coming from the trees. My heart leapt into my throat as shadows began to shift at the edge of the clearing. They were humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, their limbs too long. Their movements jerky and unnatural. Their faces were pale, featureless masks, with faintly glowing eyes. They stood just beyond the tree line, watching us. "What the hell?" Liam started, but Tasha grabbed his arm and yanked him off the altar. "Run!" she said, her voice shaking. We ran, the watchers gliding silently after us. No matter how fast we moved, they stayed just behind, their glowing eyes never blinking. The forest seemed to twist and warp around us, the path disappearing beneath layers of leaves and roots. At one point, Liam tripped, and I stopped to help him. He grabbed my arm, his face pale. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I shouldn't have touched it." "What are they?" I asked, but he didn't answer. We kept running until we stumbled back onto the main trail. For a moment, I thought we were safe. But then Liam stopped, breathing hard, and turned to face the woods. "They're still here," he said. "I can feel them." Tasha grabbed his hand. "We need to keep moving." But it was too late. The watchers emerged from the shadows surrounding us. They didn't speak or attack. They just stood there, their eyes fixed on Liam. One of them raised a long, skeletal arm and pointed at him. Liam stepped forward, as if in a trance. "I can fix this," he said. "It's my fault." Tasha screamed, trying to pull him back, but the watchers closed in. One of them touched her shoulder, and she collapsed, unconscious. I wanted to help, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like the air itself was holding me in place. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Liam, surrounded by the watchers, his face twisted in terror as they reached for him. I woke up on the side of the trail, Tasha lying next to me. She was pale and trembling, but alive. Liam was gone. We made it back to the campground in silence. Neither of us spoke about what had happened. I packed up my RV and left that same day, driving without stopping until I was hours away from Devil's Tombstone. When I finally pulled into a rest area, I found something on my windshield, a small wooden totem, carved in the shape of a screaming face. I don't know how it got there. I don't want to know. I haven't been back to the woods since. Sometimes I see things in my peripheral vision, shadows that vanish when I turn, glowing eyes in the dark. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know the truth. They're still watching. My name is Samantha Hart, and I'm 28 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened a year ago in a place called Raven Hollow, deep in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. It was supposed to be a week-long camping trip with my old college friends, Mark, Jenna, and Elliot. We hadn't seen each other in years, and this was our way of reconnecting. Instead, it became the most harrowing experience of my life, and I barely made it out alive. It all started with the RV breaking down. Mark was driving, as usual. He was always the take-charge type, even if he rarely knew what he was doing. Jenna sat beside him, her fingers nervously toying with the amulet she always wore, a little silver charm she called her protection talisman. She believed in things like energy fields and curses, and while I'd usually tease her about it, I didn't that day. Maybe I sensed something was wrong even then. Elliot and I sat in the back, joking about how Mark had ignored every online review of the RV rental place. The vehicle groaned as it climbed the final stretch of dirt road into Raven Hollow. "See?" Mark said, grinning as he killed the engine. "Told you this was worth it." He wasn't wrong. The view was breathtaking. We were surrounded by towering pines, their dark green boughs casting cool shadows across the forest floor. A small clearing opened up near a creek, where we decided to park the RV. No cell service, no other campers. Just us and the wilderness. "We're really off the grid now," Jenna said, her voice tinged with unease. The first night passed uneventfully, aside from the oppressive silence. No owls, no crickets, just nothing. I joked that the animals were scared off by Mark's snoring, but truthfully, the quiet unnerved me. The second day, we decided to explore the forest. Armed with a map that looked like it came from the 1980s, we hiked along a barely visible trail until we stumbled upon something strange. "Guys, look at this," Jenna said, crouching by a tree. Carved into the bark were strange symbols, circles, lines, and shapes that looked like crude animals. "Probably just old graffiti," Mark said, brushing it off. But Jenna didn't. Her eyes darted nervously between the symbols and the woods around us. "These are protective sigils," she whispered. "I've seen them in books. They're meant to ward off spirits." Mark rolled his eyes. Or they're just some kid's art project. That night, the silence returned, heavier than before. The third night was when things started happening. I was outside the RV with Mark. stoking the campfire while Jenna and Elliot prepared dinner inside. The flames crackled, casting long, flickering shadows across the trees. Then Mark froze. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing toward the tree line. At first, I didn't. But then I noticed it. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, standing just beyond the firelight. "Hello," Mark called, his voice firm. The figure didn't move. "Probably just a deer," he muttered, though his tone wasn't convincing. He shone his flashlight into the woods and the figure vanished, leaving behind only the sway of branches. When we told Jenna and Elliot, they didn't believe us. "Probably just your imagination," Elliot said, "or too much whiskey." But I knew what I'd seen. The next day, Jenna refused to leave the RV. Mark and I went to check out the creek while Elliot stayed behind to keep her company. The water was freezing, but it felt good on my hands. I splashed some on my face, laughing as Mark flicked water at me like a little kid. For a moment it felt normal, then we heard it. "Help!" A voice echoed through the forest, distant but clear. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, his expression darkening. I nodded. The voice came again, closer this time. "Help me." It sounded exactly like Jenna. "Stay here," Mark said, grabbing a branch as a makeshift weapon. "I'll check it out." "No way. I'm coming with you." We followed the voice deeper into the woods, but it kept moving, luring us further and further from camp. When we finally stopped, panting and disoriented, we realized we were completely lost. "That wasn't Jenna," I said, my chest tight with fear. Mark didn't argue. By the time we made it back to the RV, it was nearly dark. Jenna and Elliot were furious, and rightly so. But before we could explain, Elliot cut us off. "You were calling for help," he said, pointing at me. "No, I wasn't," I said. "Yes, you were," he insisted. "I heard you outside yelling for me to follow you. When I opened the door, you were gone." My stomach dropped. Jenna whispered, "Skinwalkers." "What?" Mark asked. "They mimic voices, they lure you out, isolate you," she said, her hands trembling. "That's ridiculous," Mark snapped. "It's probably just, I don't know, echoing or something." But his words sounded hollow, even to him. That night, we decided to stay in the RV, locking the doors and windows. The fire outside had burned out, and the only light came from the dim bulbs inside. Then the banging started. First, it was on the roof. Heavy footsteps, pacing back and forth. Then the sides of the RV, as if something was dragging its claws along the metal. "Don't look outside," Jenna whispered. "It'll know we're here." But Mark couldn't help himself. He peeked through the curtain and his face went white. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer, just kept staring. Then a voice came, muffled but unmistakable. "Let me in." It was Elliot's voice, but Elliot was sitting right next to me. The RV's battery died, plunging us into darkness. Jenna scrambled to light a candle while Mark grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer. "We need to burn something," Jenna said. "It's the only way to keep them away." "What are you talking about?" Mark asked. "Just trust me," she shouted, rummaging through her bag and pulling out a bundle of herbs. We piled sticks and paper into the sink and lit them with a match. The flames flickered, casting eerie shadows. Outside, the footsteps grew louder, more frantic. Elliot stood by the door, holding it shut as something tried to force its way in. "I can't hold it much longer," he yelled. Then the door burst open, and Elliot was yanked into the darkness. We didn't have time to think. Mark grabbed the knife and led the charge outside. The flames from the RV sink were enough to drive the creatures back momentarily, giving us a chance to escape. I'll never forget the sight of them. tall, skeletal figures with glowing eyes and twisted animal-like faces. They moved like shadows, too fast to follow. We ran through the forest, the firelight fading behind us. I don't know how long we ran, but by the time we reached a ranger station, it was dawn. Elliot's body was never found. The rangers dismissed our story as a bear attack, but I know the truth. Those things are still out there, watching, waiting for their next victims. I haven't been camping since, and I never will. My name is Caleb Reed, and I'm 34 years old. What I'm about to share happened a year ago during one of my RV trips through New York. I had recently left my job and sold everything I owned to live off the grid, driving from place to place in search of peace, purpose, or maybe just distraction. At the time, I was still trying to cope with the loss of my wife, Emily. Grief has a way of consuming you, and I thought solitude would help me deal with it. That's what brought me to Hemlock Ridge, a remote stretch of forest near the Hudson Highlands State Park. It was supposed to be quiet, serene, perfect. But by the time I left, I was no longer the same man. The drive up was uneventful, just miles of winding roads surrounded by dense trees and the occasional glimpse of the Hudson River. When I arrived at Hemlock Ridge, the first thing I noticed was the mist. It hung low over the ground, swirling like it was alive. The air was damp and cold, but the place was breathtaking. Towering hemlocks stretched toward the sky, their branches twisting like ancient hands. I parked my RV in a clearing near the edge of the ridge and stepped out to take it all in. It was quiet. Too quiet. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just the faint sound of my own breathing. I shook it off, telling myself this was exactly what I wanted. I was setting up a small fire when a voice startled me. "New around here?" I turned to see a man standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a lined face and piercing blue eyes. "Yeah, just passing through," I said. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Name's John. This here's Hemlock Ridge, beautiful place, but..." He paused, looking at the mist curling around the trees. "Best to be gone before dark." I laughed nervously. "Why's that?" John's eyes met mine, and for a moment his face looked grave. "This place has its guardian, big ol' hound, keeps watch over the land. It don't take kindly to strangers." "Like a ghost story?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Call it what you want. Just don't stay too long," he said, then turned and walked off, disappearing into the trees. That night, I couldn't shake John's warning. I told myself it was just a local trying to spook a newcomer, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the mist thickened, and the silence became oppressive. I was dozing off in the RV when I heard it, a low, guttural howl that seemed to echo from every direction. It wasn't like any animal I'd heard before. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the mist, but I couldn't see anything beyond the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was probably a coyote and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I found tracks around the RV. Massive paw prints, each one twice the size of my hand. My stomach twisted. Whatever made those prints wasn't a coyote. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it had to be a bear, even though I knew better. I spent the day exploring the ridge, but the unease never left me. The mist clung to everything, and no matter how far I walked, I always felt like I was being watched. That afternoon, I ran into a ranger named Anna. She was in her late 20s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and a warm smile. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," she said. "I'm just camping for a few days," I replied. Her smile faded. "Hemlock Ridge isn't the best place for that. Locals say it's haunted." "I've heard," I said, thinking of John. Anna glanced at the mist. "If you hear anything strange, or if you see tracks, just leave. Don't wait to figure it out." Her words stayed with me long after she left. That night, the howls returned, louder this time. They didn't sound distant anymore. I was sitting by the fire when I saw it, just a glimpse at first. A massive black shape moving through the trees, its eyes glowing red. It was watching me. I froze, gripping my flashlight. The creature didn't move closer, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, half hidden in the mist, until the fire began to die down. Then it disappeared. I hurried inside the RV, locking the doors and shutting the blinds. The third day, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed up my things and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I had no choice but to wait for someone to pass by. As night fell, the hound returned. It started with howls, then the sound of something scratching at the RV's metal walls. I held my breath, gripping a kitchen knife as the scratching moved to the door. Then the door handle jiggled. I threw open the blinds, shining my flashlight outside. The beam landed on the creature. A massive hound with jet-black fur and glowing red eyes. Its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I bolted out the back door, running blindly into the forest. I don't know how long I ran, but I eventually stumbled into a clearing. At its center was a stone altar, covered in moss and carved with strange symbols. John's words echoed in my head. "This place has its guardian." The hound appeared at the edge of the clearing, its growls vibrating in my chest. I knew I couldn't outrun it. Desperate, I yanked the chain from around my neck. On it was Emily's wedding ring, the only thing I had left of her. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please, just let me go." I placed the ring on the altar and stepped back. The hound stopped, tilting its head as if it were studying me. For a moment, everything was silent. Then it turned and vanished into the mist. When I returned to the RV, it was as if nothing had happened. The battery worked, the scratches were gone, and the air felt lighter. I left Hemlock Ridge at first light, vowing never to return. Even now, I can't explain what I saw, but I know this. The hound was real. And it's still out there, guarding the ridge, waiting for the next intruder. My name is Olivia Bennett, but most people just call me Liv. I'm 31 years old, and I make my living as a freelance wildlife photographer. Last year, I spent a week in a place called Black Creek Valley, near Sterling Forest State Park in New York. What happened there still haunts me. I'd been to plenty of remote places before, but nothing prepared me for the nightmare I faced in that valley. It was late spring when I arrived, and the forest was alive with vibrant greens and the sounds of rushing streams. The drive up was uneventful, just narrow, winding roads flanked by towering trees. Black Creek Valley was known for its diverse bird species, and I planned to capture photos for a magazine feature. I parked my RV in a small clearing near the tree line and set up camp, eager to explore the next day. But from the moment I stepped outside, something felt off. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the usual symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves was strangely absent. It wasn't silent exactly. There was a faint humming, like distant machinery. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination and spent the evening reviewing my camera equipment. That night, the storm hit. Around midnight, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like some wounded animal. Rain lashed against the RV windows and thunder rumbled so deeply it rattled the walls. I'd dealt with bad weather before, but this storm felt personal, like the valley itself was trying to scare me off. By morning, the storm had passed, but the damage was done. My tripod was bent, my favorite lens was cracked, and water had seeped into my camera bag. I swore under my breath. This trip was supposed to be a chance to unwind, not add to my stress. Determined not to let the storm ruin my plans, I ventured into the forest with my backup gear. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. Clusters of mushrooms growing along the forest floor. They were unlike anything I'd seen before, glowing, faintly blue-green, with delicate caps that pulsed ever so slightly. When I got closer, I heard a faint hum, like the mushrooms were alive. I snapped a few photos, noting to research them later. But as I leaned in for a close-up, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It felt like I was being watched. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there, just the dense forest and creeping mist. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling, so I decided to head back to camp. On my way back, I stumbled across a small cabin with a faded sign that read Ranger Station. A woman was standing on the porch, her hands on her hips, watching me approach. She introduced herself as Anna Harper, one of the few rangers who still patrolled the valley. "You camping out here alone?" she asked, her tone cautious. I nodded. "I'm a photographer. Thought this place would be good for birds, but so far it's been quiet." Anna frowned. "That's unusual. This area is usually teeming with wildlife." "Maybe the storm scared them off," I offered, though her expression didn't change. "Maybe," she said slowly, "but if you hear anything strange or see something that doesn't feel right, don't stick around. Black Creek Valley has a history." "What kind of history?" I asked, half joking to hide my unease. "Disappearances," she said bluntly. "People go missing out here. No explanation, no trace. Just gone." I laughed nervously, thinking she was trying to scare me. "I'll be fine," I said, brushing her off. She didn't look convinced. That night, I woke to a tapping sound on the RV window. At first, I thought it was a branch, but when I peeked out, I saw something that froze me in place. A humanoid figure stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall and impossibly thin, its skin dark and textured like tree bark. Its head tilted slightly, as though it were watching me. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the trees. But when I stepped outside the next morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt. They were human-shaped, but elongated, with toes that ended in sharp points. Desperate for answers, I drove to a small diner in the nearest town, hoping to find someone who could explain what I'd seen. That's where I met Beth Gray, a local historian with a sharp wit and a skeptical attitude. "The Veil Shadows," she said when I described the figure. "That's what we call them. Legend says they were once guardians of the forest, spirits that kept everything in balance. But when settlers came through and destroyed their land, they changed, corrupted. Now they're parasites, feeding on anyone foolish enough to stay too long." "Is this real?" I asked, trying not to sound hysterical. Beth shrugged. "Depends on what you believe. Either way, if I were you, I'd pack up and leave." By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting, and the mist was thicker than ever. I barely had time to lock the doors before the scratching started. It was soft at first, like a mouse scurrying along the walls. Then it grew louder, more deliberate. Scrapes and thuds that shook the RV. My breath caught as shadows moved past the windows. They were tall and slender, flickering in and out of sight like they were part of the mist. I grabbed my survival knife and flashlight, unsure of what I was even preparing to fight. Then the spores started. The glowing mushrooms I'd seen earlier had sprouted along the edges of the clearing, and their faint hum grew louder. The spores floated through the air like tiny embers slipping through the cracks in the RV. I covered my mouth with my shirt, but it was too late. My vision blurred, and the world tilted sideways. Through the haze of hallucinations, I saw the shadows closing in. Their bark-like skin glistened, and their glowing blue veins pulsed with every step. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Then I remembered Beth's words. They were guardians once. They only attack if they feel threatened. In a moment of clarity, I grabbed my camera and scrolled through the photos I'd taken. One of them showed the forest bathed in sunlight, a rare moment of peace I'd captured before the storm. I removed the memory card, clutching it like a lifeline. "This is for you," I whispered, stumbling outside and placing the card on the ground. The shadows paused, their heads tilted, and the humming from the mushrooms quieted. One of them stepped forward, its movements jerky but deliberate. It crouched, picking up the card with long, clawed fingers. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the shadows melted into the mist. When the sun rose, the mist was gone, and the forest felt alive again. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. I packed up and left without looking back, my RV covered in scratches but otherwise intact. Weeks later, as I edited my photos, I noticed something strange. In every image of the forest, faint shadows lingered in the background, watching, waiting. I haven't been back to Black Creek Valley, and I never will. But sometimes in my dreams, I hear the humming of those mushrooms, and I wonder if the veil shadows are still watching me. My name is Jenna Wolfe. I'm 27, an aspiring filmmaker, and this is the story of how my obsession with the paranormal nearly got me and my friends killed. This happened just a few months ago, in late October, during a trip to the Catskill Mountains. A trip I'd organized to film an episode for my YouTube channel. I thought it would be fun. I thought it would be safe. I was wrong. It all started when I convinced my small circle of friends to join me at Devil's Tombstone campground. The name alone was irresistible, tied to a local legend about a witch burned alive centuries ago, her body buried beneath a cursed gravestone. Locals say her spirit still haunts the area, feeding off the fear of anyone foolish enough to disturb her resting place. Perfect material for my channel. Ryan, my best friend, had reluctantly agreed to come along. He's 26, a practical guy who's terrified of anything even remotely supernatural. His girlfriend, Kara, was also with us. She's 25, quiet and superstitious, exactly the type to believe in curses. Lastly, there was my younger brother, Leo. He's 22, reckless, and always looking for a thrill. I should have known he'd take things too far. We arrived at the campground just before sunset. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with orange and purple. Devil's Tombstone was small, just a handful of sites surrounded by dense forest. It felt isolated, perfect for what I had planned. Ryan and Kara immediately began setting up the tent while Leo wandered off, claiming he wanted to explore. I unpacked my camera gear, already excited to start filming. The forest had this strange, oppressive silence, like the trees were holding their breath. I made a mental note to capture that feeling in the video. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped sharply. We gathered around a small fire, eating sandwiches and sipping from thermoses of coffee. I started talking about the legend, recounting how the witch had been accused of cursing the town, blamed for crops failing and children dying. When they finally caught her, they burned her alive and buried her body beneath a large tombstone, inscribed with strange symbols to trap her spirit. "That's just folklore," Ryan said, trying to sound confident. "None of it's real." "Maybe," Kara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why take the risk? Leo grinned. "You don't actually believe a ghost is going to get us, do you?" "It's not a ghost," I corrected him. "The legend says she manifests as a shadow, a shape that grows stronger the more afraid you are." Ryan rolled his eyes. "Great. So, the more scared I get, the more likely I am to die. That's comforting." That night, the first sign of trouble came. I was lying in the tent reviewing footage from earlier when the camera glitched. Static filled the screen, and the battery, fully charged an hour ago, suddenly died. Frustrated, I reached for another battery, only to find it drained too. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft I thought it might be the wind. "Jenna." I froze. My name, spoken in a voice that wasn't human. It sounded like dry leaves scraping against each other. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, scanning the trees with my flashlight. Nothing. The forest was deathly quiet, not even the rustle of a squirrel. I told myself I was imagining things and went back to bed. The next morning, things got worse. We hiked deeper into the forest, following an old trail that wasn't on the map. Kara had read online that it led to the witch's tombstone, though no one had been able to confirm its exact location. The deeper we went, the stranger things became. The GPS on Ryan's phone kept glitching, spinning us in circles. Birds stopped chirping, and the air grew unnaturally cold, even as the sun climbed higher. We found the tombstone around noon. It was half buried in moss and dirt, tilted at an odd angle. Strange symbols were carved into the surface, circles, lines, and what looked like runes. Kara stared at it, her face pale. "These are wards," she said. "They're supposed to keep something trapped. Or scare people away," Ryan muttered. Leo knelt beside the tombstone, brushing away dirt with his hand. "You think the witch is still under here? Maybe we should find out." "Leo, don't," I started, but it was too late. He knocked on the stone with his knuckles, laughing. "Hello, Mrs. Witch, are you home?" That night, the whispers came back, louder this time. They circled our campsite, overlapping, growing closer. "Jenna, Leo, Kara." Ryan was the first to snap. "Okay, who's messing with us? This isn't funny." "No one's messing with us," Kara said, her voice trembling. "It's her." Leo tried to laugh it off, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I turned on my camera, hoping to capture whatever was happening. That's when the shadow appeared. It started as a flicker at the edge of the firelight, a shape that didn't belong. It moved too quickly to be a person, darting from tree to tree. I pointed the camera at it, and for a moment, I saw it clearly. A tall, humanoid figure made of darkness, its edges rippling like smoke. Kara screamed. Ryan grabbed her arm, pulling her closer to the fire. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "But we need to leave, now." We packed up in a frenzy, abandoning most of our gear. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing darker, the whispers louder. Leo ran ahead, claiming he saw a light in the distance. Kara begged him to stay with us, but he didn't listen. That's when we heard his scream. "Leo!" I shouted, running after him. I found him standing in a clearing, staring at something I couldn't see. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "It's her," he whispered. "She's right there." I looked through my camera, and my blood ran cold. The shadow was behind him, towering over him, its hand-like appendages reaching for his shoulders. "Run, Leo!" I screamed. He didn't move. The shadow wrapped around him, and he was gone. We stumbled out of the forest at dawn, exhausted and terrified. The police didn't believe us when we reported Leo missing, chalking it up to an accident or a prank gone wrong. They searched the area but found no trace of him, or the tombstone. A week later, I reviewed the footage on my camera. Most of it was corrupted, but one clip remained intact. It showed me in the clearing, calling out for Leo. Behind me, the shadow loomed, its hollow eyes fixed on the lens. I uploaded the video to my channel, hoping someone would understand what we went through. Instead, it went viral, spawning conspiracy theories and online debates. People called it fake, a hoax, a clever marketing stunt. But I know the truth. And sometimes late at night I hear the whispers again. My name is Morgan Fletcher. I'm 35 years old, a travel nurse by profession, and someone who prides herself on being self-reliant. I've spent countless weekends camping alone in the wilderness, and I've never been one to scare easily. That changed last October, on a trip to Pine Hollow Campground in the Adirondack Mountains. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a chance to recharge after a grueling work contract. Instead, it turned into the most harrowing experience of my life. I arrived at Pine Hollow late in the afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the towering pines. The campground was as remote as I'd hoped, tucked away miles from any town. There wasn't a single other camper there, perfect, or so I thought. My RV hummed softly as I backed it into the farthest site. The spot was idyllic, a clearing surrounded by dense forest, with a trailhead leading deeper into the woods. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and for a moment, I felt the weight of my stress begin to lift. I set up quickly, plugging in my generator and preparing a simple dinner. The quiet was immense, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Normally, I loved that kind of solitude, but as night fell, the silence felt wrong. It wasn't peaceful, it was expectant. The first sign of trouble came that night. I was in the RV, reading a dog-eared paperback when the generator sputtered and died. Darkness swallowed the interior, and the temperature seemed to drop instantly. I grabbed my lantern and stepped outside to check the generator. It looked fine, no loose wires, no visible damage, but no matter how many times I tried, it wouldn't start. Frustrated, I gave up and decided to rely on my battery-powered lanterns for the night. As I walked back to the RV, I noticed something odd. The trees around my campsite had markings on them, carvings I hadn't seen before. Spirals, stick figures, handprints. They looked fresh, the bark still bleeding sap. I told myself they were graffiti left by other campers, though deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I decided to shake off the unease with a hike. The trailhead near my site wasn't on the campground map, but I figured it would loop back eventually. I packed a day bag with water and snacks, strapped on my boots, and set off. The forest was dense, the canopy so thick that the sunlight barely reached the ground. The trail was faint, more of a game path than a proper hiking trail. Still, I pushed forward, enjoying the challenge. But after an hour, I started to notice the same carvings I'd seen near my campsite. The patterns were identical: spirals, stick figures, handprints. I hadn't passed the same spot twice, yet the carvings seemed to follow me. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to keep moving. That's when I heard it. A voice. It was faint, like someone calling from far away. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind, but as I stopped to listen, I realized it was my name. Morgan. The voice was soft, almost melodic, but it didn't sound natural. It sounded distorted, like a recording played too slowly. I called out, but there was no response. The forest fell silent, except for the pounding of my heart. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was sinking low. My nerves were shot, and all I wanted was to leave. But when I opened the door to the RV, my blood ran cold. Someone, or something, had been inside. My belongings were scattered, my supplies torn open. Food wrappers littered the floor, and muddy footprints led from the door to the back of the RV. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the trail, my hands shaking. The footprints stopped abruptly in the middle of the floor, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. That night, I barely slept. I locked the doors and windows, propped a chair under the handle for good measure, and sat with my hatchet in hand. Around midnight, I heard the voices again. Morgan! This time, they were closer. They circled the RV, coming from all sides. I peeked through the curtains but saw nothing. The pounding started next. Soft at first, then harder. Knocking on the walls, the roof, the windows. I shouted, "Who's out there? What do you want?" The pounding stopped. For a moment, the silence was so absolute it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then I saw it. A shadow moved across the clearing, tall and impossibly thin. Its limbs were elongated, its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. It had no face, but its head turned toward me as if it could see me through the window. The lantern flickered, and the RV was plunged into darkness. At dawn, I decided to leave. I didn't care if it made me look foolish. Whatever was out there, I wasn't sticking around to find out. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the RV wouldn't start. The engine groaned, sputtered, and died. I tried again and again, but it was no use. I was stranded. Desperate, I decided to hike back to the main road, a 5-mile trek through the forest. I packed what I could carry and set off, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The forest seemed alive now, watching me. The carvings were everywhere, more frequent and more intricate. The voices followed me, louder than before. "Morgan!" I stumbled into a clearing and fell to my knees. In the center of the clearing was an old hunting snare, rusty but intact. It looked like it had been set recently. I was still staring at it when the shadow appeared again, stepping into the clearing with me. It didn't walk. It glided, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it moved. "Stay back!" I shouted, brandishing the hatchet. The shadow didn't stop. It reached out, its fingers impossibly long, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. My vision blurred, my thoughts tangled. The forest seemed to close in, the trees leaning closer, whispering. "You can't leave." I don't know how I made it back to the RV. My memory of that hike is a blur. A series of flashes. Running, falling, the shadow always behind me. When I finally reached the RV, the engine roared to life on the first try. I didn't question it. I drove straight out of Pine Hollow, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I told the authorities what happened, but they didn't believe me. They said the carvings were probably vandalism, the voices a figment of my imagination. Pine Hollow was closed a week later, though, officially due to hazardous conditions. I haven't gone camping since. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I hear the faintest whisper, carried on the wind. Morgan. My name is Caleb Hunter. I'm 41 years old, a retired firefighter trying to find some peace after years of chaos and tragedy. That's what brought me to Bluebird Hollow, a quiet little campground near Seneca Lake in the Finger Lakes region of New York. I thought the solitude and beauty of the place would help me clear my head. I didn't realize I was walking straight into a nightmare. It started as a simple weekend getaway. My RV was stocked, the fishing gear packed, and the drive to Bluebird Hollow was uneventful. I even stopped at a gas station near the turnoff, where an older man was happy to chat. "Heading to Bluebird Hollow, are ya?" he asked, squinting at me like he could size me up in a glance. "Yeah, heard it's a nice spot," I replied, trying not to encourage the conversation. "It's quiet, all right," he said, his tone shifting. "Just don't listen too close to the lake at night." I laughed it off, thinking it was some local superstition meant to spook outsiders. He didn't laugh back. The campground was as picturesque as I'd hoped. Thick trees surrounding a clearing, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine, and the shimmering expanse of Seneca Lake just a short walk away. I found a spot at the edge of the campground, parked my RV, and set up camp. The first evening was uneventful. I grilled some fish I'd brought with me, enjoyed a beer, and watched the sunset over the lake. The quiet felt almost too perfect, but I didn't mind. After years of noise and fire alarms, I welcomed the silence. As night fell, the fog rolled in. Thick, almost tangible, it crept between the trees and wrapped around the RV like a ghostly shroud. The only sound was the occasional lap of water against the shore. I told myself it was peaceful. That night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream. A soft humming, high and lilting, like a lullaby sung from far away. It drifted through the fog, growing louder and softer as if carried by the wind. I got out of bed and looked out the RV window. The lake was barely visible through the mist, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the sound persisted, tugging at my nerves. It wasn't an animal, and it sure as hell wasn't a song the wind could carry. I tried to ignore it and went back to bed, but the melody lingered in my mind. The next morning, I decided to shake off the unease by fishing. The lake looked peaceful in the daylight, the fog lifting to reveal calm, glassy waters. I cast my line and sat on the shore, waiting for a bite. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a ripple in the water, like something had disturbed the surface. Then I noticed a shape beneath the water, pale and indistinct, like a reflection. But there was no one else around, and the figure didn't match my movements. I stood up, staring harder, but the shape disappeared. A cold chill crept up my spine. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. The day passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence that had been so comforting now felt oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. That evening, I made a fire and tried to relax. The old man's words at the gas station crept back into my mind. Don't listen too close to the lake at night. I laughed nervously, tossing another log onto the fire. "It's just a story," I said aloud, as if saying it would make it true. The second night was worse. I woke again to the humming, but this time it was closer. It wasn't just a sound. It felt like it was inside my head, threading through my thoughts. Caleb. My name, whispered in that same melodic tone. I bolted upright, grabbing the flashlight by my bed. The beam of light cut through the RV's windows, illuminating nothing but swirling fog. I stepped outside, my boots crunching on the gravel, and scanned the trees. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. The humming stopped. The silence was worse. The next morning, I decided to hike around the lake, hoping some fresh air and exercise would help me clear my head. The trail was overgrown but manageable, winding through dense trees that seemed to close in the farther I went. That's when I found the fishing pole. It was lying on the shore, abandoned, next to a tackle box filled with rusting lures. A set of muddy footprints led from the water to the trail and stopped abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished. "Probably just some kid messing around," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. The fog thickened as I made my way back to the RV and the humming returned. This time, it was louder, insistent, wrapping around me like a net. "Caleb." I broke into a jog, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, she came to me. The fire had burned down to embers, and the fog was so thick I couldn't see the lake anymore. I was sitting in the RV, trying to read, when the humming started again. This time, it was accompanied by a shadow, a figure standing at the edge of the trees. She was tall and willowy, her dress flowing like water. Her face was pale, serene, but her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Caleb," she said, her voice soft and mournful. "Come with me." I froze, unable to move or speak. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me like a physical weight. "I can take your pain away," she whispered. "You've carried it for so long. Let me help you." Images flooded my mind. Faces of the people I couldn't save, the house fire that had ended my career, the guilt that had gnawed at me every day since. She knew. She saw everything. I felt myself stepping forward, drawn by her voice. At the last moment, something snapped inside me. My training kicked in, and I grabbed the lantern from the table, hurling it toward her. The glass shattered, and flames erupted, lighting up the clearing. The woman screamed, her voice splitting into a dozen tones, each more agonized than the last. The fog recoiled, and she vanished into the shadows. I didn't wait for the morning. I packed up my RV and left Bluebird Hollow, not stopping until I was miles away. Later, I learned about the legend of the Bluebird woman, a bride who drowned in Seneca Lake on her wedding day. They say she lures the grieving and guilt-ridden into the water, promising peace but delivering only death. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear her humming. She's waiting,